Today we will be going through the main line of the Dutch with 2g3 from both sides' perspective, and as usual we'll kind of be starting with the most common lines and just sort of working our way towards some of the sidelines from there. Of course the big choice here is between g6 and e6, and we are going to start with the main line of the Leningrad Dutch with g6, which, okay, e6 is also quite popular to include transpositions, but g6 really the most popular from this exact position, and basically the idea of the Leningrad Dutch, and a really big distinction between this position, let's say, and the version we'll see with the pawn on e6, is that black is going to try to get into e5 break in one go, kind of having the pawns side by side in the center, which sort of explains the old main line of queen e8 to prepare this e5 push, because if we get a position like this, you kind of have an improved King's Indian, where if they play d5, then you just haven't had to move the knight away, then go f5, and then bring the knight back to f6. So that's a strategic concept of what black's aiming for, but of course, when white knows this, they can try to do something about it. And if you are enjoying this video so far, do make sure to hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. And with that, I will share with you more of the subtleties of queen e8 and some of the alternatives that black can also play a bit later on. But this is sort of the old main line, where the move a5, of d5 rather, is really considered the most critical, just trying to exploit the one weakness of playing f5, that sometimes that e6 square can be a little bit weak. This is why in practice the main option for black is to go knight a6, so that we can sometimes put the knight on c5 to try to cover that weakness, or if the knight gets kicked, they can go to e4 and you can still, have this knight on a good square with some control of the center. No, it has to be admitted that in these lines, objectively, white does have a bit of a small advantage. One thing that makes the Dutch very popular at the club level is it does give you a good chance to fight and play for a win, but you are giving white a small edge if they know what they're doing, such as in a position like this. Or also after knight d4, it also has to be admitted that here too, white probably has some very small pull, but maybe a little bit less so, like if we can get in c6 or c5, that is going to at least give us some counterplay against the d5 pawn. Or if they do take on c6, which is what the engine kind of likes, then you can sort of get the central majority, like at least you've got an imbalance and something to play for there. You can also start with a5 and go for it this way to avoid b4, but I just think it's maybe a little bit less precise. Also, a move of rook e1 is also quite tricky, to be fair, where white just goes for the e4 break very directly. Now, granted, after queen f7, a move like b3 can be met with knight e4, and that's actually not so bad for black. We kind of use the pin here to stop them taking e4 so readily. But a pawn sacrifice of e4 is going to be a lot more annoying and arguably somewhat better for white, where there's not time to go into details, but you kind of end up in a lot of trouble if you try to take on c4. Then you kind of have to go knight c6 and sort of wait for him to attack your queen first, and then you're only a little bit worse as black. If you don't want to play this as black, maybe I'd suggest playing e5 and just kind of braving the rising positions with the isolated pawn in the center. Like, it's still a bit better for white, but at least the game kind of goes on in a sense. But yeah, that's sort of the argument for queen e8, and of course black does have a few different alternatives, like c6 is kind of one of the more popular lines these days, so that if white goes d5, you can now go e5, and you're sort of able to break in the center without, worrying about the b7 pawn coming under fire, as it might happen in some of the other lines. And this rising position is one where maybe white does have a very small edge with best play, but black is certainly very solid. It's very easy to see kind of what the subsequent moves are going to be, and it's just a position where you can just play for the win, but from a quite solid foundation as black. And that's the main line, but given that black is not doing that badly there, it is true that some alternatives have emerged. For example, b3 is quite popular, where you kind of have the idea of just fianchettoing, just playing very solidly. These Soto engines aren't really so keen on it, because even though in the old days people were mainly playing queen a5 or queen 7 to prepare the e5 break, well, those who are familiar with the Illingworth principle will know that why prepare a move if you can just play it immediately, and e5 does actually prove to be quite a reliable equalizer, which is something I only discovered while recording this video, so it may also surprise your opponents a little bit that you can actually play this move, but you can exploit it in your own time if you're so inclined. There are some alternatives, like rook b1 is a move that also was popular in the past, where you kind of just try to sort of use this pawn as a weakness. But to be fair, black shouldn't be doing too badly in these positions, so I wouldn't be too concerned. And finally, if they do play something like knight c6, yeah, just d5 and knight a5, queen d3 kind of leaves the knight a little bit misplaced here, like a poor man's version of a Pano kind of system. And if you play knight e5 instead, you're just going to run into some problems with white's kind of attack on the queen side just being a lot faster than anything black can really try to muster on the king side. So just not really an entirely playable line from black's point of view. And moves like e6 were played in the Tal Botvinnik game in the World Championship match, but Tal won that game, which kind of speaks to the problems that the black faces in this variation. So yeah, after knight c3, there isn't really a miracle equalizer. White is a little better in all lines, but you do get at least a bit of a fighting position. And if they do try some move or like b3, trying to take some of the sting out of the e5 break, there isn't a plan of like a5 that can give you some quite interesting counterplay. The engine's also kind of like the move of knight e4. It's also an option you may like to explore as a way to fight for the for equality. But b3 is not such a bad alternative for white in all fairness, even if I like c4 a bit better. And that pretty much covers the most of the lines with the Leningrad. Like they can play some lines where they try to go knight h3 or something, but in general I think black is doing okay in these positions. Even though it looks kind of annoying for the knight to come to f4, you can sort of bring your knight to c5 and still kind of make it work in a sense. Like one idea that really can be nice for black is to play like e5 and then the move of c6, just negating that pressure down long diagonal, being ready either to take on e6 or meet b4 with even knight c4. And that's going to give black only a marginally worse position, but still the pretty standard position for Leningrad. And tricky stuff like g3, queen b3, yeah, it stops you castling long. But against these weird systems, you can either just play a good sort of d5 move and leave their piece a bit weirdly placed in this kind of hybrid stonewall, or you can go knight c6 and play e5, which is maybe a little bit more in the spirit of the of this opening of the Leningrad. We still stick to a normal plan, just with a little bit of a difference in the move order. And they haven't really left enough time to do justice to the e6 lines, but let's give it an attempt anyway. Because after e6, there are kind of two different ways of playing it. The way that sort of the most reliable, according to modern engines, is going for the stonewall with something like bishop d6. And c6 is kind of the old main line, but you don't really see it as much nowadays, because white does have some quite appealing options, like they're not limited just to, say, go into sort of the main line with like bishop b2 and, this kind of position. But white does have some appealing extra options as well, like, for example, knight e5 is kind of an annoying way to sort of take the sting out of the b6 plan by black. And also, modern engines kind of like ideas such as either playing knight c3 and just kind of going for this minority attack. Well, technically, it's not a minority attack, but it's sort of the similar concept. And also, bishop f4 is another move that modern engines just think is going to be a little bit better for whites. Of course, you can still play these positions and, go for like knight d7 and try to get counterplay with g5 in the middle game. But objectively, white should have a little bit of an edge just because their bishop is better than ours here. And that's kind of the reason why the trend sort of shifted a little bit to playing castle short instead, with the idea being you're still happy to transpose to lines where knight maybe is not so ideally placed on c3, but where if they do play b3, you kind of have some extra options like b6, where you just don't really care all that much about the doubling about the exchange on d6, because you can kind of take with the pawn and then they don't have the outposts. So there's ideas like this that players like Magnus Carlsen have played with some success. It is true, I don't really have time to get to the d5 stonewall. There are some interesting ideas of like knight e4, h5, h4, 5 displayed by reports, but for now I'll just sort of conclude by sharing with you the Ilyin Genevsky or classical system here, where actually modern engines don't really hate it as much as they used to. It actually suggests b3 and kind of just anticipating this knight e4 as one of the more promising routes to a nice advantage for white. But if white does play knight c3, it turns out knight e4 is actually not that bad for black, with Simon Williams really being one of the big champions from black's point of view. And also when you're sort of seeing the engines giving moves like a4 as the best move for white, it sort of speaks to the fact the position is not completely intuitive in terms of what the optimal lines are from white's point of view. Like if they go knight e4, you can, play d5 and you'll have ideas to hit back in the center for maybe not full equality, but at least you get some possible counterplay. Or if white plays queen c2 and then takes, yeah, if white plays queen c3, you kind of have this very easy plan of just like preparing e5, a very healthy position. And yeah, the move BC freeing over e4 probably does give white a small advantage objectively, but it's still a position where black can play, where at least you've got a fighting position with some, some interesting chances for both sides. In any case, that's all for the G3 Dutch in 10 minutes. I'd prepared a few other variations, but yeah, that's all we have time for this one. So with that being said, yeah, I will see you in the next training video, where we'll continue with this in 10 minutes opening series. Obviously, we'll have a separate one for the other Dutch lines without G3 as well. But yeah, until then, take care.